The year is 1066. These three guys fought each other over the throne of England. This one called William won, becoming King William I, better known as the Conqueror, who ruled England for about 2 decades before getting old and dying. The throne then passed to his middle son, also called William. But the oldest son, Robert, didn't really like this arrangement, and so started a civil war over it. They actually fought for quite some time, until Robert had to leave to go fight in the First Crusade. While Robert was out crusading, the third son, Henry, accidentally killed William in a hunting accident. And when Robert came back home, Henry locked him up in prison for the rest of his life. And just like that, Henry I was now king. And this is where a story can begin. Henry reigned for about 30 years, where he fought a war in France, married an Anglo-Saxon princess, fixed the economy, got mad at the church, and ruled with an iron fist. He had over 20 children, only 2 of which were with his actual wife, wow. His 2 legitimate children were a son named Adelin, who was made the heir to the English throne, and a daughter named Matilda, who was married off to the Holy Roman Emperor, who was also called Henry, giving her the title Empress. So on November the 25th, 1120, teenage Adelin was having a drunken boat party in the English Channel, which ended in disaster as his ship struck a rock and everyone on board, including himself, drowned. With his heir dead, Henry had to think fast. He needed a legitimate heir, or the kingdom would quickly fall into anarchy. Fortunately, the Holy Roman Emperor died, making his daughter Matilda available. Plus, she was a pretty skilled administrator, as when her husband would be out on campaign, she would take up the mantle of ruling Germany herself. So Henry made Matilda his heir, and made all the Anglo-Norman nobles swear an oath to her. She was also married off to another man named Geoffrey Plantagenet, the Count of Anjou, having a son of him, also called Henry. Man, medieval monarchs really liked that name, didn't they? Now, Matilda taking the throne was a bit problematic. Firstly, she was a woman, Secondly, she was really disliked by the English nobility. Why? Because she was a massive jerk, just like her father. And thirdly, not long after Henry picked Matilda as his heir, they quickly had a falling out. Matilda and Geoffrey demanded that Henry give them territories in Normandy, which he angrily refused. Their relationship got so sour that when a rebellion broke out in Normandy against the king, Matilda and Geoffrey joined up with the rebels. So in late 1135, while campaigning in Normandy, Henry was served his favorite meal, lampreys. His physician told him not to be too gluttonous about it, but Henry didn't care, just stuffed his face with it, causing him to get a really bad case of indigestion, and on the 1st of December, he died of food poisoning. Or diarrhea. Sources disagree. This is where Stephen comes in. Stephen was the Count of Boulogne. He was a nephew of King Henry through his sister, and his father was a somewhat famous crusader. But most important of all, he was a nice chap. He was popular with the nobility for his charisma and chivalry. Also, he already had many allies in high places. His younger brother, whose name you'll never guess, Henry, was the Bishop of Winchester. So Stephen added up the math. I'm the old king's nephew, so I have a blood relation. The girl next in line to the throne is unpopular, and I'm popular, which means that I can be king. So before Matilda even knew what was going on, Stephen rushed to England, marched to London, got his oaths to Matilda repealed, and usurped the throne, becoming King Stephen of House Blois, and his wife became queen. His wife was also called Matilda, by the way. Man, these names are gonna get confusing. Empress Matilda was incredibly ticked at having her throne stolen, but being in France, there wasn't much she could do. Stephen's reign immediately started off with trouble. He faced an invasion from the north by King David of Scotland, who took Carlisle and Newcastle. Stephen quickly marched north and made an agreement with the Scots, where they would give back all the land they took, except for Carlisle, and in return, David's son, Henry, would be made Earl of Huntingdon. Stephen then held his first royal court that Easter. A royal court was basically a huge party, where the king would give out land to his supporters. Stephen's reign seemed secure. He had good relations with the nobles, the church approved of him, and both the Pope and the King of France recognized him. However, troubles continued. 2 nobles in the southwest rebelled, a Welsh revolt in Wales, and Geoffrey of Anjou invaded Normandy. The rebelling nobles were crushed, the Welsh were ignored, and Stephen agreed on a truce with Geoffrey after paying him 2,000 marks. With that all settled, Stephen could finally properly start his peaceful reign. Well, at least he thought he was, but that was not to be. You see, behind the scenes, one man was plotting something, waiting for the right moment to strike. This man's name was Robert of Gloucester, and the time came in 1138 when he revolted, declaring Matilda to be his queen. Why? Well, remember how Henry I had several children out of wedlock? Well, Robert was one of them, making him and Matilda siblings, and siblings gotta help each other out. Soon after Robert's revolt, these lands joined him, beginning the Anarchy, a civil war between two mediocre monarchs. Taking advantage of the chaos in England, the Scots re-invaded the north. This time, Stephen defeated the Scots in battle, but later agreed to give more land to the Scots. Someone who lived in these lands was a powerful young noble named Ranulph of Gurnon, who was super salty at having these Scots mucking about on his territory. Remember this guy, he'll be important for later. That following year, in 1139, Matilda and Robert crossed the English Channel with an army of 3,000 infantry and 140 knights. She stayed at Arundel Castle, while Robert marched west to meet up with another rebelling earl named Miles. When Stephen heard the news that his arch-nemesis had arrived in England, he bricked it, immediately marching south and besieging Arundel. Matilda was stuck. Her try at the English throne seemed to be already at an end. But then something really weird happened. Stephen just let Matilda go. It's not really clear on why Stephen would make such an idiotic decision, so what I'm about to tell you is just one interpretation. You see, Stephen, being a man in the Middle Ages, had to abide by something called the Knight's Code of Chivalry. One of those codes was to basically sip for all women. The idea of Stephen imprisoning and potentially mistreating a noblewoman like her would be disastrous to his reputation. So Henry proposed an idea: allow Matilda to go, and instead focus on defeating her supporters in battle. Stephen agreed and let Matilda go free, sending Henry to personally escort her back to Robert. You will soon find out that this plan was a bad one. Stephen then marched north to challenge Robert at Wallingford Castle. However, while on the march, his troops would be attacked by Miles, who subsequently ran east to London, forcing Stephen to ditch Robert to chase after him. This would start a pattern where Stephen would basically have to be everywhere at once. Then Robert and his men opted for fear tactics, burning nearby villages, most notably Worcester. And to make things even worse for Stephen, Geoffrey started to re-invade Normandy. Right, so I would like to take a moment to talk about the troops and tactics that we'll be seeing in the upcoming war. If you don't care about any of this, feel free to skip to this time. Most of the ground troops in the armies at the time would consist of levy infantry, local peasants and freemen who were called upon and paid by their local feudal lords. These guys would usually be equipped with simple swords, spears, and shields. The real heavy hitters in medieval warfare came in the form of knights. Knights were usually lower tier nobles or earls, who typically fought on horseback. Being nobles, they used their wealth to have the highest quality gear available for themselves and their steeds. Other types of troops and weapons were also used, such as bows, and in some rare occasions, even Greek fire. Most of the combat during the Anarchy was done through castle sieges, as battles were risky and expensive. As everybody knows, siege warfare would include an enemy army surrounding a castle or fortress and try to starve the enemy out, occasionally attacking with either battering rams, tunneling, or fire. And sieges would end with either the defending army surrendering, the attacking army giving up, or on rare occasions, the defending castle being overrun. Also, the attackers might build a counter castle. These were usually simple wooden structures that would counter the opposing castle, house the attacking troops, and protect them from an army trying to relieve the siege. Okay, back to war. So remember that Ranulph guy from earlier? Well, he was still incredibly sour at having Scots ruling his territory. So he came up with a clever little plan to get rid of them. By murdering the Scottish prince! He was in London at the time, celebrating Christmas with Stephen. Stephen eventually found out about Ranulph's plot, and personally escorted the prince back to Scotland. To Ranulph, this was the final straw. He broke into nearby Lincoln Castle, took it over, and claimed the city for his own. Fearing that this meant yet another powerful earl switching sides to Matilda, Stephen met up with Ranulph and agreed that he could have Lincoln if he agreed to stay loyal. Simple, right? Well, not quite. As a few days later, Stephen found out that Ranulph was just relaxing defenseless with his family. So Stephen decided to break his own promise and put down the threat of Ranulph for good. But Stephen wasn't fast enough. By the time he arrived in Lincoln, Ranulph had run off and promptly joined up with Robert. Robert then took his army north to Lincoln to attack Stephen, beginning the largest battle of the Anarchy, the Battle of Lincoln. Gee, how many times did I say battle in Lincoln in that one sentence? Wow. Stephen wasn't a great public speaker, so he asked one of his generals, Baldwin of Clare, to give a riling speech to the troops. Stephen's army was led by himself in the center, Baldwin of Clare to the right, and a mercenary named William of Yeat to the left, and was comprised of your standard medieval English troops, though he lacked cavalry. Robert led his center with English troops, flanked by Ranulph to the left and Miles to the right, whose troops were mostly Welsh. Before battle even began, several of Stephen's troops fled in fear. The battle went well for Stephen at first, with Baldwin overrunning the Welsh to the right, until he was forced to flee due to an arrow volley. Then, Robert ordered his cavalry to flank the enemy, and due to Stephen's lack of his own cavalry, his troops got torn to bits. More and more of the king's supporters ran away, but the king himself fought on, first with a sword, and then when that broke, he pulled out a battle axe and kept fighting. The king's rampage would only be stopped after, I kid you not, some random soldier chucked a rock at him, knocking him out and allowing for his capture. The Battle of Lincoln was over, and Stephen, the King of England, was now a prisoner of war. Stephen was then brought to Matilda, and then imprisoned. Originally, he was given a nice cell, but fearing that he would escape, he was put in chains. Now Matilda started to make preparations to become queen. Most of the nobility switched sides to her. Some of Stephen's most loyal supporters, however, went over to him and asked if they should obey the new queen or if their oaths to him were still on. Stephen agreed that, for the time being, the oaths were off. One of them was surprisingly Bishop Henry. Henry actually played a crucial role in getting the church on Matilda's side, stating that the church had it wrong for crowning Stephen, that Matilda was the rightful ruler of England, and that those who opposed this deserved excommunication. He did this complete 180 because Matilda promised him that she would make him papal legate of England. Queen Matilda, Stephen's wife, wrote up a letter to the Empress asking if she could at least have her husband back. The Empress refused, and as a result, the Queen rallied up Stephen's army to her. Matilda then arrived on London, ready for her coronation, and proceeded to tick everyone off. Firstly, she was still that same jerk the nobles so hated. She broke her promise to Henry, making him storm out of London furiously. But worst of all, she upset the common people by bringing new taxes to London. So a few days before her planned coronation, the city rose up in revolt. And to make things worse, Queen Matilda's army was less than a mile away from London. So Matilda and Robert had no choice but to flee London, barely escaping with their lives. This is actually a good spot to mention how life was like for your average peasant during the Anarchy. And to keep it brief, absolutely miserable. Well, more than usual, in large part due to the fact that both sides heavily used scorched earth. After the disaster that was London, Matilda needed to secure the territory she still had. One of those was the city of Winchester, which was being occupied by Bishop Henry. So she, Robert, and the King of Scotland... Why is he here? Anyways, they marched down to Winchester, entered the city unopposed, and put Henry's castle under siege. Winchester actually had two castles at the time. The Bishop's Castle, that Henry occupied, and opposite to it, the Royal Castle, where Matilda set up shop. Henry, like the wuss he was, ran away as soon as he saw Matilda's army. To attack the besieging troops without coming out of hiding, Henry's men threw down fire at the town. The town, being made out of wood, quickly burned almost entirely to the ground. Wow. Then Queen Matilda's army arrived, making this a double siege. This went on for a few weeks until the Empress's army began to reach its breaking point. Matilda was stuck. Again. There was no time to take Henry's castle. Her army couldn't hold out in a destroyed city, and even if she went inside of her own castle, the enemy could simply starve them out. So the Empress decided that they would fight their way out of this one. The plan she and Robert came up with would be to have their men form a single file line formation and charge at the enemy like a stabbing dagger. Then they would fight their way to the nearby river and make their escape. As you will soon see, this plan was, well, it was something, alright. Anyways, on September the 14th, they did just that. The Empress's men stormed out of the city walls and viciously attacked the Queen's army. But they quickly found themselves surrounded and all form of order collapsed. In the middle of this mess was Matilda, trying to desperately tiptoe her way out of there. She eventually made it, barely, with Robert staying behind, holding the line so she could escape. Robert continued fighting in a brave last stand until he was eventually overrun. This battle, known as the Rout of Winchester, was a disaster for Matilda. Almost her entire army was either killed or scattered, but worst of all, Robert was taken prisoner. Empress Matilda now found herself in deep trouble. She needed Robert. He was the one who led her armies, and without him, all chances of taking the throne would vanish. Fortunately for her, Queen Matilda was willing to let Robert free. Unfortunately for her, she would only do it under one really heavy condition. Stephen, you're not gonna believe your luck! A prisoner swap. Stephen for Matilda. Everyone met up and made the exchange. The king was back. Stephen, now reunited with his wife and crown, wasted no time re-establishing his power base. Most of the nobles switched sides back to him, including his wishy-washy brother. Then, the king became ill. Very ill. For months. Likely due to the conditions of his imprisonment. Matilda used this moment of weakness to send Robert across the channel to get military aid from her husband in Normandy. This would prove to be a severe lack of judgment. Just as suddenly as Stephen became ill, he quickly recovered and marched down to the now vulnerable Matilda. In a lightning campaign, he captured Wareham, Bampton, and Rampton, and was now marching straight to Matilda's capital at Oxford. Matilda's army tried to slow Stephen down by engaging him in battle, but the king just used the genius strategy of ignoring them, catching the city's garrison by surprise, torching the city, and besieging Matilda's castle. And he besieged it hard. Now, as you may recall, Matilda was able to escape a similar situation to this in the beginning of this war, due to the Code of Chivalry. But that wasn't gonna happen this time. Stephen was way too tired with Matilda at this point to give her any sort of chivalrous mercy. Meanwhile, Robert tried to get those promised troops from Geoffrey, but he refused as he didn't want anything to do with Matilda or her civil war in England. Thus, Robert returned to England with less than 400 men, nowhere near the massive army he was promised, and definitely not enough to break Stephen's siege. So instead, he laid his own siege at Wareham, hoping this would draw Stephen away from Matilda. But the king wouldn't budge. He was determined to end the threat of Matilda once and for all. Even as winter came, he kept going. Matilda was stuck. Again, this is like the third time. But this time, there was really no escape. Inside the castle, she would face total starvation. Outside, game over. Her attempt at the English throne was at an end, unless she could do the impossible. So she did the impossible. In the most romanticized version, she disguised herself in a white coat, climbed out of the window with a makeshift rope, and casually sneaked past Stephen. Then, made her escape by tiptoeing her way across the nearby frozen river, whereafter she met up with two knights and booked it as far as she could. The next day, Oxford surrendered. When Stephen found out about Matilda's escape, he was furious. This was his only chance to capture his rival, and she just slipped through his fingers. To make things worse, Matilda had fled to Wallingford Castle, one of the best, if not the best, defended castle in all of England, so there was no way on earth he was gonna catch her now. After Matilda's grand escape, the war entered into a stalemate. And it would stay like that for a while. Neither side wanted to risk a full-on battle, and instead, both took defensive strategies. England at this point was truly broken. Stephen was pretty much just the King of London, and Matilda only had power in Wallingford. The war had caused the complete collapse of any form of central government, leaving much of England to be ruled by local lords. Very few events took place during the stalemate. In 1143, Stephen launched a half-hearted campaign into Matilda's territory, but was ambushed at the town of Wilton. Outnumbered, Stephen tried to break out, but Robert's cavalry pushed him back, setting the town on fire. During the fiery chaos, Stephen was able to barely escape, mostly due to his brave commander, William Martel, covering him. Stephen would never again enter enemy territory after that. A year later, in 1144, Geoffrey Plantagenet finished his conquest of Normandy, and the new king of France, Louis VII, recognized him as Duke of Normandy. Back in England, no more major offensives would break out. Instead, both parties would engage only in small skirmishes. Also, many nobles would leave England around this time to go fight in the Second Crusade. So, it's 1147 now. This war has been going on for over a decade now, and both sides are kinda tired. Then, something massive happened. Robert, the man behind all of Matilda's success, died. With the death of her brother and most competent commander, Matilda was no longer safe in England. Thus, she had no choice but to leave England for France. She would never return. But the war was far from over. Matilda was still determined to take the throne, but not for herself. Do you remember Henry? No, not that one. Or that one. Or that. Gee, how many Henrys are there? There you go. That one. Matilda's son. Now 14, he was ready to finish what his mother had started and take the throne for himself. He invaded with a tiny mercenary army he could barely control, accomplishing absolutely nothing and running out of cash to go home. Stephen himself sent the kid money to pay for his trip back. He probably did this just to get rid of Henry quickly, as he was busy trying to get his son Eustace crowned heir. Oops. Kind of forgot to mention until now. Stephen had a son. My bad. Anyways, in 1149, Henry invaded again. For real this time. He first rode north to Carlisle to be knighted by David, then prepared an attack on York. But Stephen heard of the threat and moved up north to challenge Henry, forcing him to flee south, where he met his counterpart Eustace at De Vere's castle. But unlike another 14-year-old redhead we talked about in the previous video, Henry wasn't a great commander. He lost and ran away to France. Stephen must have been rejoiced. Matilda was gone and the new guy was a massive pushover. But his celebrations were shortcut, as in 1152, his dear wife died. Man, that got kinda dark. That following year, Henry, now a grown man, invaded again, but this time he had a full-on army. Massive side note, Henry was now married to a woman named Eleanor, Duchess of Aquitaine. She is one of the most important women in European history. And we're not really going to talk about her here. Sorry. Go watch extra credits video series on her. Links in the description. But all you need to know about her for this is that she was the wife of the King of France. They hated each other and got a divorce. She then immediately turned around and married Henry, giving him access to all this land. Anyways, Stephen rode south to meet up with Henry, who was besieging Malmesbury Castle. But nothing came of it due to the heavy rain. That's the UK for you. They soon met up again at Wallingford Castle. This was it, the final climax of the war. Everything would be decided here. Or would it? Alright, men, it has all come down to this. To battle! No. What? No. Stephen, it's over. What? This war has been going on for almost 2 decades. Everyone was done with this. The same thing was starting to happen on Henry's side, and thus they both went to the negotiating table to end this war in the most anticlimactic way possible. The church was to be their mediator, as they were neutral throughout the war. It was first agreed that Eustace was no longer the heir to the throne. Eustace himself wasn't told about this until a while later, where he immediately revolted, swearing to take back his throne, and he died of an illness 3 weeks later. Nice timing. After that minor inconvenience, the two sides got to making peace. In the subsequent Treaty of Wallingford, it was agreed that Stephen would remain king, but would adopt Henry as his heir after his death. Stephen and Henry agreed to these conditions, signed the papers, and to show to everyone that this was legit, the two men kissed on the cheek, as was custom at the time. Thus, after almost 2 decades of civil war, famine, and destruction, the anarchy was over. Stephen didn't live long after that. The latter bit of his reign consisted of him trying to recover the realm from the decades of war. And on the 25th of October, 1154, King Stephen, now an old man full of regret, died, probably of stomach cancer. Without much pushback, Henry was crowned king, becoming King Henry II. His mother Matilda, now an old woman, became one of her son's greatest advisors. Through his father, he became Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou. He took upon himself Stephen's French lands, and, through his marriage to Eleanor, he owned Aquitaine. He also vassalized Brittany. He made the Scots give back all the land they took and become his vassals. And, with the Pope's blessing, which he definitely didn't just make up, he conquered parts of Ireland, vassalizing the rest. Thus, because of the anarchy, Henry was the most powerful man in the whole of Europe, beginning the Angevin Empire.